Hi, everyone. David Aragona here with Craig Milkowski, and we are taking a look at Saturday's Grade 1 Joe Hirsch Turf Classic, one of 3 graded stakes that'll be run on that Saturday card at Belmont Park. This one's going 1.5 miles on the Widener turf course, and we've got the top 2 finishers coming out of the Sword Dancer from Saratoga, Gufo and the European shipper Japan. They finished just a neck apart that day. Gufo, as we throw up the field for this race, is the 8-5 morning line favorite, and he's definitely the horse to beat, but Craig, I don't think Gufo has some major edge over this field. It's still a pretty competitive bunch.
Yeah, it is for sure. It didn't draw the strongest quality of field, but it's certainly a field that's competitive. As I think there's about four of the horses who could win in here for sure, maybe 5. So good, solid field, and I think the pace projector is going to have something to say about this as well.
Well, let's go right to that time form US pace projector to see how these horses are going to sort themselves out in the front end. And no surprise to see the number 6 Channel Maker shown on the early lead here. Craig, there's no blue flag denoting a favors honor near the lead situation. I'm not sure if we necessarily use those very often in 1.5-mile races, but Channel Maker, he does look like the lone speed on paper.
Yeah, this is a case where we don't use that blue flag in these long races just because the percentages say not enough horses actually go wire to wire in these races. But he is a horse who looks like he's going to be clear. The pace projector shows cross border tucked in behind him. But he's a horse, if you scroll through his PPs, he is more of that tracker kind, and he's even dropped back pretty far off the pace at times. So for once, I think it looks like Channel Maker is going to be all alone up front.
Yeah, and it's no surprise to see that number 3 Gufo all the way towards the back of the pack. He is a deep closer who often is at the mercy of the pace. He might not get a lot of it here, so we'll see if Joel Rosario can keep him a little bit closer to the pace. Something that he did pretty well last time in the Sword Dancer, and let's take a look at that Grade 1 event from Saratoga where Gufo just got the best of Japan. There was a lot made of the trips in this race, Craig, as Ryan Moore saved more ground on Japan and got caught in a little bit of traffic in mid-stretch as Gufo got the jump on him. It did get close at the end, and maybe that bit of trouble right here did cost Japan the race.
Yeah, I think it did. It was a cagey ride on Gufo. He seemed to know who his competition was and just kind of pinned in Japan for just that shortest amount of time, made him lose his momentum. But no doubt he was flying at the end. So I think the margin at the finish is pretty representative of the abilities of these 2 horses because, as you said, despite that trouble, Japan did save a lot more ground, but he also had that break. Gufo was able to start his run a little bit early and run in unimpeded. So between these 2, I would say it could definitely come down to trips again.
And what do you make of these time form USPPs on Gufo, Craig? Because for a turf marathoner, he's got a lot of red pace figures scattered through his recent running lines, and it feels very unlikely he's going to get anything resembling a fast pace in this race with just nobody signed on to really press Channel Maker. So do you have any doubts about whether Gufo can be as effective if he doesn't get that fast pace ahead of him?
I do because he struggled a little bit in his first few starts when he tried better graded company, and he's just been a beneficiary of some nice pace setups. He has improved since blinkers have went on. He hasn't dropped so far out of it, so maybe that's been part of it. He's been able to stay a bit closer to the pace, but the total lack of pace in this case does scare me a little bit.
Let's also take a look at the recent PPs of the number 7 Japan, who was that narrow second to Gufo in the Sword Dancer. And one of the things I love about the time form US PPs with these European shippers is some really detailed write-ups of the races in England, Ireland, and France. You get a good perspective of how these horses were doing coming into the race and what kind of trips that they had. And you could see that Japan backed up the 124 time form rating that he had gotten in his prior race, winning a Group 3 at Leopardstown. And like we were saying, he might have been best last time in the Sword Dancer. I do think that Ryan Moore got some unnecessary flack because he did the right thing for much of the race, saving ground on the turns, and just got a little bit unlucky in the stretch, not able to angle out at the time that he really intended to. But Japan ran well there, and Aidan O'Brien has been very dangerous with his European shippers, especially this year. It feels like he's brought over some really live runners in 2021, and Japan just seems like another one of those. You know that he's going to have no trouble handling the 1.5 mile distance. Let's take a look, though, at that likely early leader, the number 6 Channel Maker, because he is the defending champion in the Joe Hirsch Turf Classic. And in 2020, he did the exact same thing that we expect him to do in 2021. He went to the front end, set the pace, and this time nobody was able to catch him, Craig.
Yeah, he finally was sent to the lead a few times last year, and he produced his best season ever. I know we had both talked about that a few times, where we wish they just let him run, and when he was able to do that, he ran some really nice races. Now this year, it hasn't been as good a fortune for him. He's been involved in some wicked fast paces. He chased Channel Cat a couple starts back. Last time out, he got into a duel with Tribhuvan, another very fast horse who's won some graded stakes this year. So this just looks like a much easier spot than me. So I really think he's got a big shot, given that there's just no other speed.
Yeah, he was running some gigantic time form US speed figures at the end of last year. You can see at the bottom of the screen, he got a 129 in the Breeders' Cup Turf. I believe he had gotten a pair of 128s in his two Grade 1 triumphs prior to that in the Sword Dancer and the Turf Classic of 2020. Like Craig was saying, he hasn't been quite the same horse this year. Maybe it's just taken him a while to get back into form since that overseas trip, but I do think there is something to that assertion that the pace might have really worked against him in his last two starts, particularly last time when you see that 166 first quarter pace rating. That's just way too fast going a mile and a half. And you do sometimes see those very large pace figures in marathon races because there's a greater variance in the pace. But you could just see it visually watching the early portion of that Sword Dancer. He and Tribhuvan really ran off on the front end. So it's no surprise that he didn't have the same sprint finish that Gufo and Japan possessed. I think the channel maker is going to run better here. I just didn't quite trust him maybe as much as you did, Craig. And I wanted to go looking in a different direction. So I was looking more towards the number 2 Arklow. And let's take a look at his last race at Kentucky Downs in the Calumet Turf Cup, where he did have some real trouble in upper stretch. And as they make the turn for home, you're going to see it happen right here. Florent Giroux is trying to send him through between horses, and the hole is going to close up right about here. He's going to have to steady, really pull back on the reins, alter him, come around the field, and the winner, Imperador, just gets the jump on him. And Arklow almost gets him at the finish of this race, but getting your momentum stopped in early stretch in one of these turf races where you're sprinting to the wire, that's pretty costly, Craig.
Yeah, I was actually the beneficiary of this trip. As on the forecast, I think that was a week you were off. I picked Imperador, but I freely admit that he was not the best horse that day. Arklow was. He got the best trip. The problem for me with Arklow is he was in not very good form before those couple races. I can understand picking him off that race, but as I mentioned earlier, when we were talking about the matron on a different video, I just tend to ignore those Kentucky Downs races because it's just such a different track. And I'm wondering if he can reproduce that form over Belmont. Obviously, Belmont's a very big turf course, but it's still not the same with the rolling hills and the just different ground. So I'm going to go against Arklow in here, but I can see why you would. He was definitely best last time out.
Yeah, Craig, as we've talked on our podcast a lot, you know that I've never been the biggest fan of Arklow. I've often knocked him in races, picked against him when he's short prices. But watching his last 3 races, it just feels like he's gotten poor trips 3 times in a row now. And sometimes riders just kind of fall out of sync with horses that they're too familiar with. And I wonder if Florent Giroux has just gotten a little too familiar with Arklow. He's tried to get him to move a little early in his recent races, and it hasn't worked out now 3 times in a row. He obviously clipped heels 3 back in that United Nations in Monmouth. That it was kind of amazing that Florent Giroux stayed in the irons that day. He lost all chance in that race when that happened. 2 back in that race at Del Mar. Trying to make a 6 wide move around the far turn is not going to work over a turf course like Del Mar. So I think that was the reason Arklow didn't run well that day. And I just think his form is a little bit dirtied up. And he actually is another defending champion in this race because he won the Turf Classic, the Joe Hirsch Turf Classic, I should say, back in 2019. So he definitely has prior form over Belmont Park. And he's getting a rider switch to Jose Lezcano. And Jose sometimes is a rider that will change things up a little bit, make a horse be a bit more forwardly placed, even if the running lines prior to this might not say that they're supposed to be. So I'm hoping that Jose Lezcano can get Arklow a bit more involved early. And let's throw up our picks for this race. I think you know who we're going with based on our comments. I'm taking Arklow in this race. He is 6-1 in the morning line. I'd hope to get a price around that because, like I said, he's a horse that doesn't have the best form coming in. His form is a little bit inferior to horses like Gufo and Japan, but I do think he's got a chance to bounce back if Jose Lezcano can work out a better trip. Craig, you're going with the speed of Channel Maker.
Yeah, and it's basically the same story. He doesn't have the same form as the top 2 in this field, doesn't quite have the speed figures, but he has the back speed figures. He has a pace edge. So, and he's going to be a decent price in this field. So that's the reason I sided with him.
pace and trips are going to be of utmost importance in this Grade 1 Joe Hirsch Turf Classic on Saturday. Thanks for watching, and good luck if you're playing this upcoming weekend.